Good evening and welcome. I am Paul Billings, the National Senior Vice President of Public Policy for the American Lung Association. First, a couple of Zoom reminders. This panel discussion is being recorded. Participants' audio will remain muted for the duration of the event, and closed captioning is available. Please see the link in the chat for closed captioning. Lastly, please submit questions to the panel using the Q&A feature. Thank you all for being here today. The premiere of Unbreathable and this panel tonight are occurring at a significant moment in history. This year is the 50th anniversary of the Clean Air Act. The Trump administration is actively pursuing efforts to roll back clean air protections and solutions to address climate change, which makes air pollution worse. We are in the midst of a pandemic, which is reminding us of the critical importance of lung health, and the fight for racial equality illuminates the many ways that people of color, especially Black Americans, are disproportionately harmed in this country, including through air pollution. This year's American Lung Association State of the Air report found that people of color are 1.5 times more likely to live in a county that has a failing grade for air pollution. New evidence shows that Black, Asian, and Hispanic people have a higher estimated risk of death from any cause in association with exposure to fine particulate matter pollution than the general population. For all of these reasons, the panel today is timely and important. We hope all of you have had a chance to watch the film before this panel, but if you haven't viewed the film yet, it will be available by visiting the DC Environmental Film Festival's Watch Now page until the end of June, and we'll share a link at the end of this panel. Now I'd like to introduce our panel of speakers. Maggie Burnett-Stogner is the director of Unbreathable, The Fight for Healthy Air, and is the executive director of the Center for Environmental Filmmaking at American University. Shoshonda Campbell is a community leader and activist for environmental justice. As a student at Ben Franklin High School in South Baltimore, Shoshonda co-founded Free Your Voice, a student-led group that worked for 5 years to shut down the largest incinerator proposal in the U.S. history, set to be built less than a mile away from their school. Mustafa Santiago Ali serves as the Vice President of Environmental Justice, Climate, and Community Revitalization for the National Wildlife Federation. Earlier, he worked for the EPA for 24 years, including in the Office of Environmental Justice, and for the Hip Hop Caucus, a national nonprofit that connects the hip hop community to the civic process to build power and create positive change. Bill Riley was administrator of the US EPA from 1989 to 1993, during which he led efforts to pass the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments. He served under 4 US presidents, President Nixon, George H.W. Bush, President Clinton, and President Obama in various capacities. Beth Gardner is an American journalist based in London. The Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting and the Society of Environmental Journalists both awarded grants to support Beth's work on Choked, her first book, which focuses on air pollution. And a personal note, if you care about the air you breathe, Choked is a must read. I'll be asking each of our panelists a series of questions, and then we'll take questions from the audience. Please remember you can ask a question of the panel at any time by chatting your question using the Q&A feature. All right, let's get to the panel. Let's start off with you, Maggie. As the producer of the film, what did you hope to accomplish with this film going forward?
Thank you, Paul, and I want to thank everybody for tuning in to our live panel. This is not a typical way. Typically, we would premiere the film in a theater, but we're getting it out there anyway. And I have a lot of thank yous, but we only have an hour, so I'm not going to be able to thank everybody. I directed the film. My producer, Elizabeth, was amazing. Shannon Lawrence, who worked with us on this film since the very beginning. You know, a lot of shout outs to Matt Cipollone and Matt Twyford, all of whom are alum from the Center for Environmental Filmmaking. So we really had a great team and many others. I really need to take a moment and say thank you to the partners, the American Lung Association and AU Center for Environmental Policy and AU Center for Environmental Filmmaking to make this film possible. And to the panelists, many of whom are in the film, and everybody else who participated in the film and opened up their homes, their hearts, and shared their stories with us. This film is powerful because of that. It just wouldn't be the same. And, you know, we started this film thinking 50-year anniversary of the Clean Air Act, and who really knows what the Clean Air Act has done? I can remember as a child going to Los Angeles, and the smog was just horrific. You never saw the mountains, your eyes would burn. And now it's, you know, you see the mountains, it looks clean. So, you know, we've come a long way. There's been a lot of accomplishments, but it's not equal. You know, there's been still a lot of places that don't have enforcement of the Clean Air Act laws that are so important. There's not accountability. Nearly half of Americans still live in places with unhealthy air. And so what is it going to take to really come together? It's not a partisan issue, you know, it's health, it's a human right. So what is it going to take to really come together with that civic engagement and that community dialogue to make sure that there's healthy air for everybody? And that's the real goal of this film, is to try to get it out there in a way that people can use it and bring people together and really fight for healthy air for everybody.
Thank you, Maggie. Shoshanda, what motivated you to first start advocating for clean air in your community?
I started as a high school student in a group that I helped co-found, which was For Your Voice. And we were just talking about the issues that we've seen in our community. And we found out about a proposal to build an incinerator. And we came together and we wanted to fight against that. We knew that that wasn't going to be good for our community, and that we already had a lot of asthma rates that was very high in like our school and in our community. And so we fought back against that. And so that was how I got involved, and I stayed involved because, as Maggie said, clean air is a human right. And in my community of people of color, a lot of people of color, they didn't get that, and that wasn't right. And we all knew it wasn't right. And so if we wanted to change, we knew we had to be the change that we wanted to see. And so that's how I got involved.
Thank you. Mustafa Santiago Ali, as we think about building an equitable future with clean air and a healthy climate for all, how do we make sure that everyone experiences the benefits and no one is left behind?
Well, I think one of the ways that we make sure that everyone is dealing with the benefits is to stop the disproportionate impacts that continue to happen in communities of color, in lower wealth communities, and on indigenous lands. We stop the siting of fossil fuel emitting facilities in communities of color. We know disproportionately that those facilities are located in Black and brown communities. We know that the fossil fuel infrastructure that feeds those facilities primarily runs through Black and brown and indigenous communities, low income white communities, and through farmland. We got 2.4 million miles of pipeline in our country that is playing a role in feeding those industries, and they're ending up on the Gulf Coast and in other locations. And we also know that because of people's long-term exposure to particulate matter, and to some of the other air, things that we'll talk about tonight, that we are causing these long-term chronic medical conditions that are making folks more vulnerable to COVID-19. But there are also the impacts that are happening day in and day out in these communities. They are experiencing cancer clusters. They are experiencing liver and kidney diseases. They are experiencing the lung diseases. All of these things are making people more vulnerable, that are making people sick, and it's shortening people's lives. So the way that we make sure that equity is actually in the process is by minimizing the location and these impacts that are happening in these communities, and stop creating sacrifice zones.
Thank you. Bill Riley, you served as EPA Administrator during the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments. What lessons from the 1990 Clean Air Act fight can apply to today's battle?
Well, one of the most important things is communication. And we had, before the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments, a unique configuration of heat and resulting air pollution in the major cities across the country. The pollution alerts were consistent week after week after week. There was an election going on, a presidential election. President Reagan had not been known for particular sensitivity to things environmental. And so his vice president was not expected to make an issue of the environment. To everybody's astonishment, and very effectively from the point of view of his campaign, he committed to a comprehensive new Clean Air Act. Now, once elected president, he was in a unique position to bring Republicans who had not particularly espoused environmental issues and hadn't really made records on that, together with the opposition of Democrats, or I say the opposition of Democrats. There was a coalition of Democrats who were against any changes in the clean air issue, largely on regional interest. The Midwest was the source of acid rain. The Northeast was the victim of acid rain. And for 12, 14 years, it had been impossible to reconcile those two interests. Well, with a committed president and the sense that the pollution had gotten completely out of hand, and that even the Western folks, mountain states who had not previously been so involved, decided essentially as a culture. And I think this is a very important thing to recognize. It wasn't just that the politics worked, it's that behind the politics was a change of culture, a sense that we had some very severe problems, particularly evident in the acid rain impacts in the Northeast and forest destruction. That created the groundswell. The president ran with it, and it was difficult for those who were opposed to any changes to oppose him at that time. And so we got a very impressive, very creative bill, and it was a much more cost-effective bill than anyone had expected. It turned out it was cheaper to reduce sulfur dioxides, given the way that the president and the administration proposed to do it, with pollution rights, trading and permits and the rest. And it was it's probably the last time, as I look at it, when we had in this country a genuinely bipartisan and very significant advance for the environment.
Thank you. Beth Gardner, for your recent book, Choked, you did an incredible amount of research into the history and impact of the Clean Air Act. What is one thing that really surprised you when you're writing that book?
Well, I think actually the thing that surprised me the most came before I started writing the book, and it's what motivated me to go so deeply into this issue. I live in the UK, actually, in London, even though I'm American, and this is a pretty polluted city. And I guess it's 8 years ago now, I was working on an article that was to do with the 2012 Olympics coming to London at that time. And sort of tangentially, it touched on the issue of air quality vis-a-vis the athletes. And so in order to write it, I had to sit down and do a little bit of research and educate myself on the science of air pollution and its impact on human health. And it honestly took about 5 minutes of Googling before, my jaw was really dropping, because here I am, a person who is a journalist at that time, sort of moving towards becoming an environmental journalist, lives in a pretty polluted place. And I was just absolutely astounded by just the very, very profound impact that the air we breathe has on our health. And that was twofold. I think the first thing that shocked me was just absolutely the scale and the power of that impact. When you start reading about air pollution and health, you very quickly come across these really enormous and frightening numbers, which are death estimates for almost every country, city, region, of how many people are killed early, die prematurely every year in that place because of the air that they breathe. It's 7 million people globally. It's over 100,000 in the United States. It's 9,000 every year in London, where I live, just in the city. So that on its own blew me away, how I had not known of that. And the other thing that shocked me in reading some of that science was the tremendous variety of the ways that air pollution affects our bodies. So, I think most of us would be, and I certainly was, pretty prepared to accept that and to believe that breathing dirty air would, exacerbate your asthma if you were a person who had asthma, or that it could cause other breathing problems or even lung cancer. I was ready to believe that. But what shocked me was when I started reading actually how much further it goes, and that air pollution in some ways, like smoking, affects almost every part of our bodies. You know, it's linked now by a very, very overwhelming body of science, as you know, Paul, to, you know, everything from increased rates of heart attacks and strokes to Alzheimer's disease, many, many kinds of cancer, premature birth, birth defects, obesity, diabetes, and the list just goes on and on and on. So, you know, as an individual and a parent, a person living in a fairly polluted city, obviously that kind of bothered me and frightened me personally. But as a journalist, more importantly, I think it really struck me as an incredibly important story that was not being adequately told. You know, I think we all know that if there was any other sort of threat that was taking this sort of toll on people's health and killing this many people year after year after year, you know, it would be front page news. We'd be talking about it all the time. And that was not and is not the case for air pollution. So I felt like this was really a story that needed to be covered and needed to be told. So I guess that's the surprise that started me on this project.
Yeah, the power of those stories is really important. And Maggie, when you were making the film and driving through Cancer Alley, and the woman you interviewed was pointing to the houses and pointed who had cancer here and there, that was very powerful. And I think that it brought home to me the personal impact of air pollution on a community.
Yeah, no, I think, and I have to say, I was not on that shoot. That was Elizabeth, and the cinematographer was Matt Cipollone, and Elizabeth, the producer, and you know, Mary going by and just neighbor after neighbor, friend after friend died of cancer, has cancer. I mean, that's Cancer Alley, and when you hear somebody saying that and showing that in such a personal way, you can't ignore that. You know, it becomes really personal. It becomes really intimate. And when we set out to do this film, we looked at a number of different areas that were having issues across the country and trying to find, you know, powerful stories that we could share through the film so that people would understand not just kind of the theory or the regulatory policy piece of it, which is also very important, but that they could understand the human impact. And as Beth was saying, you know, that there's a wide range of human impact and issues that are caused by unhealthy air. And so we wanted to find several different stories that represented different areas. Had we had more time and things hadn't gotten kind of shut down production-wise from the virus, we would have been more. There's so many, many, many stories out there. So Cancer Alley was one of them. Clairton, Pennsylvania, where one of the U.S. Steel coke plants had a major issue and didn't share that information with people, kept running their plant. And the kids' asthma went up in the area stratospherically, you know, all the health problems, the kids couldn't play outside. The community came together to really put pressure on enforcement and accountability in that situation. And that happens in many different places. Shoshanda's story, you know, in Curtis Bay, Baltimore, another one where, you know, there was the possibility of an incinerator plant that could be built right near the school and would have been built if it hadn't been for, you know, a group of high school kids who came together and said, no, 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 you know, let's come together and really fight this. But, you know, so those are three of the stories in the film. And there's the story of LA and the cars and, you know, and others kind of, but there's so many more stories. I think that's the real takeaway from this, is that there's so many more stories. So the stories we chose to put in the film hopefully inspire, and other people will share their stories as well and come together to make a difference here.
We've got a lot of questions coming in the chat, and please remind folks to chat your question to the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. There are a number of questions that talk about some of the gains we're seeing in clean air because people are staying at home because of the pandemic. Mustafa Santiago Ali, I'm going to ask you what we're seeing in communities, and are these gains real or are they temporary? And what can we expect the long-term public reaction to perhaps seeing some cleaner air during the last few months?
Well, there are real gains that are going on, but they're temporary gains if we go back to the way we were living before the pandemic started. We have to have a just transition. We have to shift the sources of energy that we use. We also have to shift away from some of the decision making that's got us into the moment that we find ourselves in. So it's not by accident that, you know, in our housing, we know the restrictive covenances, we know the redlining that was used to separate communities, to move certain folks into certain areas and then disinvest in those. So in this moment of opportunity, we have to make sure that we no longer make those types of mistakes. We know that our transportation system and our transportation routes, and Maggie had just mentioned a little bit about cars. So yes, you know, we know that our transportation routes have also had a racial component to them, in separating and breaking up communities, moving wealth to certain communities, and dumping off pollution in other communities. So if we are going to truly have cleaner air, from this moment moving forward, then we have to understand that there is a holistic set of strategies and opportunities that are going to have to be, you know, utilized for us to do that. And I'll just call out the fact that, you know, the folks in Cancer Alley who have been fighting for decades upon decades upon decades to have clean air. When you go to the Manchester community in Houston, Texas, and if you roll down your windows there, you feel like you're breathing in gasoline fumes. That's a hardworking Latinx community. That's unacceptable. And when you go to Port Arthur, Texas, where refineries as far as the eye can see, you also have a very similar dynamic. They're a hardworking African-American community that was a strong middle-class community. And as we allowed these types of entities to move into that space, it began to lose that vitality. When you go to areas like in Southwest Detroit, the 48217, which is the most polluted zip code in the state of Michigan. And when kids open up their windows and when they look out, they see piping instead of trees, then all of that plays into this moment that we find ourselves in, where we no longer know, we definitely know that we no longer need many of the things that we thought that we needed, that we can survive, that we can thrive. And by doing that, we can actually help these communities that have been disproportionately impacted begin to have the foundation that's underneath of them so that they're not literally dying for their last breath.
Some of these problems you highlight have gone back decades, generations. Some predate the Clean Air Act and some have not gotten any better in the past 50 years. But Bill Riley, one of your predecessors, Administrator Ruckelshaus, this is one of the questions we have, was famous for saying to be transparent and follow the science, follow the law. Question is, the current EPA under leadership of Andrew Wheeler has not been transparent, does not follow the sciences, does not follow the law. Can EPA recover? And what are the consequences for public health of an EPA that is not following the science and not being transparent?
Well, if you don't follow the science and you're running a regulatory agency with enormous impact on the economy and on the behavior of people, what do you get your authority from? How do you know what the public health requires and will benefit from? Science is, it's the secular religion. It's the basis for all of the integrity that regulators can confer. This administration has not acknowledged the importance of science. They sacked the Science Advisory Board in one of their first moves, and they have not been willing to hold independent hearings on several key regulations that have important health consequences, the mercury rule and others. And one of the reactions against that, the Union of Concerned Scientists has itself convened the former members, all very distinguished individuals, professionals, scientists, to act as though they were still the Science Advisory Board and to give their considered opinion on a particulate standard. They issued the standard after 2 days of hearings, very transparent, public was involved, comments were taken. In other words, they did all of the things that the government had not done. And they came up with a different particulate standard. And some states actually chose the nonprofit Union of Concerned Scientists particulate standard over the government standard. The following consideration of an environmental pollutant, the new appointees, the administration's scientific appointees, balked at the preparation that the government had made, saying it was inadequate scientifically. And so they resisted their own administration, I think having been somewhat shamed by the exposure of the previous scientific analysis. None of that should be necessary. There is a long-standing history. And another thing that Ruckelshaus, the first administrator, said is when he took office, he was required to set standards, the basis for which was not that sound. He didn't have much science. There was epidemiology still to be done, a lot of analysis to be developed, and yet he had to proceed. But it was therefore a top priority of him and of his successor administrators to make sure that EPA did have great integrity based upon solid science. And historically, they have had that. I think the agency can recover. As I travel about the country, I'm reminded constantly, particularly by people who ask me whether they should stay the course and continue to work at EPA, that it's filled with people, I think some 18,000 people, who believe in the mission. And they will believe in the mission when they're run by a new administration. And I will express a lot of them a sigh of relief when that moment comes and they can return to listening to the science.
Thank you. The film touches on, actually spends quite a bit of time talking about the role of Ed Muskie writing the act, and interviewed Tom Jorling, who was one of the key staffers to write the law. Beth, you looked at the origins of the Clean Air Act and how science and health were at the core of the law. And that, I think that that's what makes the Clean Air Act different from other laws. It makes the United States approach to air quality different than other countries. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, your dad, Leon Billings, plays a starring role. My book is really a global look at air pollution. I traveled all around the world. It's got a lot of chapters from the US, but I devoted an entire chapter to the US Clean Air Act because it is so significant, not just in the United States, but in the world. I mean, we were talking earlier about surprises, and I think one of the things that surprised me when I started to learn about this was to realize that the United States in many ways is really a success story in terms of its progress on air quality. Obviously, right now we're going backwards, and where we are is far from where we need to be, but where we are is dramatically better than where we were 50 years ago, and that is because of this law. Ed Muskie, the senator from Maine, is sort of seen as the father of the Clean Air Act. And it really was, though, a bipartisan effort. Sadly, I didn't have the chance to interview your dad, who was an aide to Muskie on the Senate subcommittee on, what was the name of the subcommittee? I can't remember. It was a new committee on air and water pollution.
Air and water pollution, the Public Works Committee, correct.
Yeah, and Ed Muskie created that committee because no other senator was really interested in that topic. And Tom Jorling, who's in the film and was a very close friend of your dad's, worked very closely for him. With him. He was the staff attorney on the Republican side of the committee, and your dad, Leon, was the staff attorney on the Democratic side of the committee. The two of them would drive home together, share rides in the pickup truck, dictating legislative language. And, in talking to Tom Jorling about his memories of that time, and in listening to and reading some of the things that your dad had spoken and recollected about it that were on the record, what was just so striking from today's vantage point was the bipartisanship and just the functionality of the system. The law was not perfect, the system was not perfect, there was disagreement and all of that, but it worked. The system functioned, and it managed to produce a law that was just so groundbreaking in so many ways. and that really set the stage for the progress that we've seen since then. It had a tremendous number of really innovative provisions in it. It was the first law to include a provision called citizen suit, for example, which gives citizens the right to sue our government if they fail to uphold the law. That is something that has been tremendously consequential and was used in other laws as well. So there was a lot of just really very smart kind of design involved in the law. But I think the biggest decision there, the most fundamental decision, was that these senators, and the law was passed unanimously in the Senate, and if I remember correctly, with one no vote in the House, reluctantly, but signed by a Republican president. The law decided that the only consideration that could be, the only thing that could be considered in setting the standards for what the levels of air pollution would be allowed in the United States, there was only one thing you could consider, and that was public health and what was best for the health of Americans, not what was technologically feasible, not what was hard or easy to do with, engine design or power plant design or any of that, and not dollars and cents. Obviously, there's a lot of horse trading that goes on, and it's not applied to reality in its purest form. But that is what the law said, and that was really that reprioritizing was literally really was nothing short of revolutionary in the way that it upended the way that things had been done before.
May I just interject? It's not fair to say that it was a reluctant Republican president. The extraordinary thing about President Nixon was, though he himself did not have any particular feeling or background in pollution law, he signed the National Environmental Policy Act, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and that list goes on. And he decided before he even began his campaign to make the environment an issue when he saw that the national mood had three issues of concern to the American public: the war in Vietnam, the economy, and in third place was the environment. It had never been in that league before. So he was supportive of it, irrespective of his own personal, probably, preferences and authorities, expertise.
Well, first of all, thanks, Beth, for remembering my dad. And Bill, I just want to correct you. Congress actually argued to override Nixon's veto of the Clean Water Act of '72, but he did sign the Clean Air Act and NEPA.
Yeah, but they did it. They did it. He had reasonable economic considerations, and I think he played a fairly constructive role in an administration that was concerned about costs, and among other things. And it was a hugely expensive bill, the Clean Water Act. So I just, I'm not a great Nixon proponent, but I was there at the Council on Environmental Quality, and the people around him were working to get legislation that he could sign, and he was prepared to sign it. So I just wouldn't assume that there was a left, right, or Republican, Democratic conflict on that. Everybody came together in the end on those statutes.
There was a great quote. Sorry, Paul, just really quickly. There was a great quote that came up in a couple of memoirs of various aides, and I can't remember who said it, but shortly before Nixon died, one of his former aides said to him, "Mr. President, you'll be remembered as a great environmental president." And he said, "God, I hope not."
All right. Well, we've heard a lot about the 70 Act and the 90 Act. Shoshana, you've been organizing in communities. I think what's going to take to move forward for clean air and climate policy is bringing people together and organizing communities. Can you talk a little bit about your experience, the specifics around the incinerator in Baltimore, and then other panelists respond on what they see as the path forward to addressing the existential threat that is climate change that we're facing right now?
Yeah, sure. So when we were organizing as students, when we first heard about the incinerator, it was doing a lot of outreach. It was telling our neighbors and our community members what the plan was. And no one knew about it. It wasn't a surprise. We didn't even know about it at first. And so then it took telling them what was going on and explaining what health causes this was related to, and why our community was being impacted in this way. Just to speak to it, we have a medical waste incinerator. We have open coal pile that's right across from our rec center, across from the playground where the kids play at. And then we have another incinerator, which is the Willowbrae incinerator. And then we had a proposal for the largest incinerator in the nation to be built less than a mile away from our school. And so there was pollution coming from all different angles. And so that's what we coined the term a dumping ground community. It was as if no one cared about this community. And when talking with neighbors and community members, they were saying, this is not going to change. This has been going on for many of years. And so it was changing that mindset that when we come together, yes, these are $1 million companies. Yes, there is this dynamic that they have the say so. But then when you push back at that, and we all come together, we realize that our voice is very strong. And we tell them what we're not going to accept anymore. And so that was with organizing. It's just this belief that our community power and people power is always going to be stronger than multi-million-dollar companies coming into communities and trying to burden them with pollution. And so that was an efficient tool, organizing and talking with people and relating to them what was going on and hearing their stories. And a lot of people did know about like the pollution. They knew the air was bad, and they would talk about how when they come outside, they didn't know what the air was going to smell like. And so that was a problem, and it wasn't fair. And to be exact, a community that's about 35 minutes away from the South Baltimore community is called Roland Park. We have 15 years less of a life expectancy related to them. And so that just speaks to all of this pollution in one place, to this community that's predominantly people of color, and then this wealthy community that's really white people. And so it wasn't fair that these dynamics were happening, and we were putting names to them. We were telling people about it. And people from all sides were coming to say, we don't want this anymore. It was calling out people that was gonna buy energy from that incinerator and saying, hey, you are the school system. You shouldn't be buying energy from this, something that's gonna harm these students. You should respect our lives. It was going to all these places and speaking out and telling them what we weren't gonna accept anymore. And so just knowing that when we come together, we can make a change, and we can put a stop to polluting these communities and saying certain people don't matter. That was definitely a big thing that we had to realize and speak out about. And that's why we named ourselves Free Your Voice, is talk about what's happening, and realize that we all see it happening, but someone has to change it, and we can't keep waiting for whoever that person is. You have to be that person to change it. And getting youth involved. Youth are very strong in like telling their parents, telling their families, speaking out. And that's what we learned. We learned the power of working with students. And I work with students now, and they're so amazing. Like, they speak their voices, and they talk to whoever about it. And they actually are passionate and care about it and can help carry this movement. People from all age ranges, people from all colors can help with this movement, because it is affecting us all. And so that was what the tactic that we use. It was just relating to people around what was happening. It was real, and putting a name to it.
Can you talk a little more about what you're doing with students now?
So right now what we're doing, so we took, after that, when we realized like, we didn't want to keep saying what we didn't want. We wanted to tell people what we wanted for our communities. And so all of the youth, they came together, and we talked about like, what did we want in zero waste. They launched a zero waste challenge to challenge people to think about all the things that you're using, that you can think about not using, and then looking at it from a bigger scale, like this is a systematic change that needs to happen. And so it was working with businesses, universities, and institutions around figuring out what they were doing, like with not recycling, without composting, all of these things that wasn't taking place here in the city, and it's still not. And so we did a zero waste plan, and the students had a lot of voice in that. They met with communities, all of the communities around the city, to talk about this plan and what they wanted to get out of this plan, especially the impacted people. And that plan was adopted. The zero waste plan for fair development was adopted by the city council. And so now students are meeting with people to figure out how they can implement this plan in a real way, and talking with the city to see what they can push forward. And so that's what the students are doing, and they're engaging other youth around these issues, around what's happening in their parents and their families. And community members, they're doing outreach. They're talking about this in a real way that, like, we need to make a change. We're tired of having asthma. We're tired of our community. Our asthma rate is way higher than everyone else's. And so it has to stop. And all of the like cancer in our community is very bad. And so we need it to stop. And a lot of people, when you talk to them, they say, hey, I'm not even from here, but when I moved here, I got asthma or I got cancer. And that's not okay. And these people shouldn't have to move away from their communities because they're afraid of where they were born, determining their life expectancy. Everyone deserves to live a great life, and have clean air. It's a human right. And so the youth that do care about that, they are fighting for that. That's what the youth are doing now. And we're in schools talking with other students from all grade levels about what's happening. For example, we had one student that was like, okay, what is that? The incinerator. He's like, oh, I thought it was a cloud maker. And so it was so cute, but it was so bad to see that, like, this has been so normal in these communities that students are trying to, like, justify what it is. And then we have to tell that child, like, no, that machine is polluting your air. It's hurting your family. It's hurting you. And so that's what we do. We do a lot of outreach to students and families and community members to talk about what's happening and creating that change. Instead of just saying, we don't want pollution. We don't want that. But what we do want is zero waste. We want to move our communities past this and remedy what they have been going through for many of years. Our incinerator has been here for over 30 years. And that's not right because it's been polluting these communities and it has to stop.
Mustafa, how can we connect this conversation that's happening in Baltimore with the larger conversation that's happening around Black Lives Matters, climate change, and the larger conversation that's happening across the country right now?
Well, we make sure that we are properly and authentically engaging with environmental justice organizations, environmental justice networks, frontline leaders who have been in these fights for decades now. You mentioned Black Lives Matter. You know, a part of the platform is now also focused on these issues that we're discussing today, because everyone understands that we have to have a holistic approach to addressing the systemic changes that need to happen, because we understand, you know, if we're going to have real talk and an honest conversation, that there has been systemic racism that has got us to the positioning that we find ourselves in today. It's not the total aspect of it, but it does play a role, so we cannot ignore that. And we also understand, you know, that we have to be focused on a regenerative economy. We have to be focused on regenerative agriculture and a number of the other aspects. We need to be focused on energy democracy and making sure that we're giving power back to the people in determining, you know, their energy sources. We also, and Shoshana gave us the blueprint. We just have to listen. You know, it's about the mobilization of people. And making sure that we are returning power to them so that they can also get engaged on the local and the county and the state level to make sure that our legislators are living up to, well, you know, their responsibilities and their oaths, and also that our tax dollars are not being used to poison us. So we know the steps to do. The question is, are we willing to do them? And I would say in this moment now, we don't have a choice. Folks who are on the street of all different colors, of all different faiths, are saying that the 21st century is going to look like the 21st century is supposed to. This is no longer 1940 or 1950 or 1960 or 1970. We know what needs to be done. So let's make sure that we get it done.
Maggie, you have a reaction to?
Oh, yeah, well, yes. You know, I grew up in Berkeley and with parents who were very political and also very strong environmentalists. And, you know, one of the things that I have to say, I thank them every day for giving me that foundation. One of the things I learned from them early on is this isn't just step in and do something and then step out. This is a lifestyle. This is a commitment. This is a focus that is every day, and it runs deep. It's systematic, and it has to be part of our fabric It has to be part of the fabric of the country, has to be part of who we are. And one of the things that Shoshana, I mean, wow, you know, so when I first heard about your story, I'm thinking, yeah, boy, you know, that brought back some good memories of mobilizing around an issue, bringing the community together. But it took you guys 3 years, and I thought, wow, that is tenacity. That is commitment. That is saying, you know, we're not going to just get in there and try and do a few protests. That was saying, no, we are going to hang in there until we make that change happen. We're not going to give up. We're not going to, you know, just say, well, we tried and okay, because you can't give up. And there's so much more that needs to be done, and you're continuing to do it, and you've made it part of your commitment. And I think that's, you know, and what Mustafa is saying is, you know, it's pervasive, and now is the time to really step up and just have a different way of approaching our lives and being committed and coming together, coming back together. I think if there's any one thing that I would love to see is, well, one, everybody get out and vote, please vote. We try to get that message across in the film too. It's important, civic engagement. We are the government, vote. But the other thing is to really see people come back together. With these last few years, people have been divided more than ever, and I don't think we can accomplish the 21st century, you know, that Mustafa and others, you know, that vision of really a healthy, in so many ways, a healthy 21st century for everybody. And that's coming together. And yeah, Free Your Voice is a great model for that.
Thank you. Got some different questions here. I'm trying to read through to find one that might haven't touched upon directly. Well, here's a question that's a little bit out of the box. It says clean air is a human right, but not a legal one. Is it time to have a clear right to clean air and water in the Constitution? Bill or Beth?
Well, you know, I have always been wary. I spent a lot of time working on water issues, both in the public sector and later in private sector. And there's long been a debate about whether or not there should be a human right declared to clean water. And on the surface of it, it makes a great deal of sense. But the problem is, back in 1947, I think it was, we had a right declared to a suitable home. How did it go? Decent home and a suitable living environment in the United States. Well, you know, I live in San Francisco. We have a lot of people who would really like to act on that right and find out who's responsible for making good on it. So you have to be careful not to contribute to cynicism. We do have a structure in the Clean Air Act, as was mentioned, that allows you to act on your rights by invoking a citizen suit. You have to identify the source of pollution. You have to have, you know, reasonable proof of the fact that it's impacting on you and all of those sorts of things that are part of our system. I think myself, that's as good as we can get. I don't think that putting it in the Constitution, unless we provided who it is we should talk to or sue, or who is compelled to grant that right when we see it transgressed. I wouldn't, unless we can do that. If we could do that, that would make a lot of sense, but I don't see how practically speaking we could do it. But as was mentioned, the Clean Air Act is an unusually resourceful and accessible way to enforce rights to a quality environment. And we have similar rights in safe drinking water and water and a number of other areas which have pioneered really in the United States and have been passed in some other countries. Many countries don't have anything like those citizen rights. So I think that's what we need to rally around today and make sure we try to keep, even though this administration appears determined to roll several of those rights back.
Did I mention voting?
Somebody did, I think.
Well, we've had a challenge where we see that the systematic racism has left many communities behind that still are breathing dirty air and drinking dirty water, and new, more polluting facilities are trying to be sited in these communities. We've also seen, I think the New York Times says, are about 100 environmental protections rolled back by the current administration. What can be done to try to undo that damage going forward and to change so that we are not seeing the same levels of burdens of health burdens being piled up on communities already overburdened. And I'll take it to the whole panel. So why don't we haven't heard from Beth in a bit. We'll start with you and work our way around.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that we are at a moment right now where a lot is up in the air. You know, there's a tremendous amount of policy and decision making up in the air around this health and economic crisis that we're in the middle of. And there's a tremendous amount of money, you know, sort of waiting to be allocated through these you know, federal programs of hundreds of billions of dollars of lending and spending to try to stimulate the economy. And I think it is increasingly looking like this moment, this crisis is going to be a pivot point one way or the other. You know, are we going to pivot in a direction, you know, as a country, but also as a world, you know, towards a place where we're going to spend this money and move in a direction that is, you know, greener and healthier and fairer and more equitable? Or, you know, there are very powerful and wealthy and well-resourced industries who are also trying to sort of make the most of this moment. You know, not just the very, very aggressive deregulatory agenda we've seen being advanced by the Trump administration over the past 3.5 years and accelerating over the past 3-4 months while the pandemic has been going on, but, you know, also trying to grab at all of this money, the stimulus money that's available. The fossil fuel industry is getting hold of a lot of it, and other industries are too. And, you know, that is a lifeline for them. This is an industry that has been starting to struggle with a lot of sort of pretty fundamental economic problems over recent years. Is this crisis going to be a moment that gives them a lifeline to, you know, and sort of extends the life of that industry and keeps the oil and the gas pumping with all the health and justice and climate consequences that we know that has? Or is this going to be a moment where we decide to put those resources somewhere else? But, you know, I think we know that sort of one way or another, we're not going back where we came from. I
Mustafa,
think, you know,
are we
it's
at a
up in
point of
the air
inflection?
which way that's going to go.
Mustafa, are we at a point of inflection?
Almost definitely. There is a culture shift that is happening, not only in our country, but across the planet. And there are folks who are coming together and working in collaborative partnerships who, in many instances, used to just work in their silos. So that is a moment where folks are getting stronger. You have philanthropic organizations that are redirecting resources to help to build the capacity and to help folks to have what they need to properly be able to engage in this. You have local governments, county governments, state governments who are stepping up. When we see, you know, unfortunately, the administration that we currently have weakening and rolling back, you know, some of these critical foundational elements that we need to be healthy, you know, folks are moving into that space, especially in relationship to climate. When, you know, they pulled away from the Paris Climate Accord, you know, you had governors and mayors, you know, filling in that space and doing what they can. That does not take away the responsibility that the federal government has to be doing the right thing and to be protecting ourselves. So I'm very optimistic in this moment that with this cultural shift, that people will stay engaged, that they will hold people accountable. They will actually, on the personal level, also make better choices about how they may be playing a role and causing some additional impacts, but also understanding that when we all come together, real change can actually happen.
So we're almost out of time. I just want to go quickly off a point you made. You said you're optimistic. I want to ask everyone if they're optimistic. So Shoshanda, are you optimistic about the future for clean air, climate?
I am. Everyone's talking about it. It's being talked about a lot of places, and people are partnering together to know what each other are saying, and saying it and doing it and voting and demanding better, and not trying to reform the system, but create a new one that's just. This system that we have right now is a racist, inequitable system, and it has got to change. And so I am optimistic that it will.
Bill, are you optimistic?
I would have to say, I really want to be optimistic. I think there's a groundswell of interest on the part of a lot of people in this country for a better environment and for attending to climate change. However, I have to say that compared to 1970, when you could not but be a friend of the environment, we're far away from there right now. One thing that this movie is about is to try to get people to act on their convictions and what the polls show they care about. Because what members of Congress tell me is when they go to their constituencies, they are not asked about the environment, and pollsters say people are not voting the environment. So I want to be optimistic. I want to be hopeful. The history of environmentalism in America is a marvelously successful enterprise. But for the moment, I don't see the energy sufficient to take us where we have to go.
Beth, optimistic, hopeful,
Well,
or
depends on the day, I guess. I mean, certainly when I hear young people like Shoshana, you know, talking about these issues and the energy that she has and that the students that she's working with has, I mean, that's amazing. And I think also the recognition that has really started to become very widespread that, you know, environment is not just a sort of, you know, distant issue that's about forests and polar bears and things like that. It's about people and human health and injustice. And, you know, I think the more that people recognize that, the closer that we get to taking the steps that are necessary to really deal with these problems.
Maggie?
Well, you know, I'm a naturally optimistic person, and I have to say I'm getting more and more optimistic. There was a while there where I wasn't so much, but you know, one of the joys of working with youth and at American University is I'm surrounded with a lot of very active, engaged young people, and seeing the youth activist movement of today, I think, is very hopeful, but we can't just put that burden on youth, right? I hear people say, oh yeah, that's our hope, it's the youth. Well, it helps me get more and more optimistic, but it's not just on them, it's on all of us. And so in that regard, I agree some with Bill that, you know, it's gonna take all of us coming together, and we need to push even more. We're seeing, I feel like we're just at the forefront of something that could be so much bigger and so much more powerful if we just keep going. We just have to get in that mode of, you know, let's make this real commitment. And I'm really hoping this film gets used far and wide and helps bring people together to have that, you know, be that catalyst for engagement. But, you know, it's one film of a whole lot of things that need to happen. And so yeah, optimistic. Today, I'm very optimistic.
Well, I watched the film again today, and it does give me hope. It makes me optimistic. And we are about out of time. Before I wrap, I'd like to hand it over to Maggie to make some final announcements about the film, and then we'll close.
Yeah, so I want to just make everybody aware that there's a website. It's just www.unbreathable.org. We also have an email if you are interested in using the film for a screening event in schools or whatever it is. Please email events@unbreathable.org and just let us know, and we'll work with you to get you the film. The film will be available to stream on the DC Environmental Film Festival website on their homepage. That's just dceff.org. And again, I just want to say thank you to everybody who participated in the film, who worked on the film. You know, it takes a village. It takes a lot of collaboration. So really, thank you, everybody, partners and everybody.
Well, I want to thank you. I want to thank all of our panelists, Maggie, Bill, Mustafa, Shoshana, and Beth, for taking your time to be with us this evening. I want to thank everyone who's joined us on Zoom. This will be recorded. The film is available. Keep this conversation going, and thank you so much. Have a great evening, and keep working hard for the air we breathe and for a safe climate.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, everybody.